The Third Succession War commenced on March 28, 66, when the Draconis Combine invaded the Lyran Commonwealth. Within a year, the entire inner sphere was once again engulfed in flames. Even the most optimistic heads of state had not earnestly believed that the peace would last, and thus had never truly ceased wartime production. But a mere 30-month pause in the carnage was not nearly enough time to recover from their losses. Some were better prepared than others, however. Of the 5 great houses who had contested the First and Second Succession Wars, none had come off worse than the Capellan Confederation. They had lost significant territory to both of their neighbours, dozens of systems had been abandoned, and the last conflict had ended with humiliating concessions by Chancellor Dainmar Liao towards his counterpart in the Federated Sons. The Chancellor had become so unpopular that the Capellan nobility among the House of Scions began to openly discuss whether they could remove the head of state. Such talk was tantamount to treason, and the ruling prefectorate swiftly put an end to it by dispatching the dreaded Maskarovka to pay the ringleaders a visit. Regardless, they all understood that if the war resumed, which it soon would, the devastated Capellan Confederation armed forces had little chance of stopping the far more powerful Federated Sons or Free Worlds League. One possible solution was arrived at by Colonel Komachi Amara of the Prefectorate Guard. He had long been enamored with the teachings of another Capellan colonel, Haritsa Hikaru, who first proposed the idea of a warrior house based upon the ideals of the Lorix Order. This centuries-old creed, first published by Major Calvar Lorix, envisioned an elite cast of MechWarriors who would dedicate their lives solely to perfecting the art of combat. The lower classes would see to it that all their needs were met, but in exchange they would expect their protectors to exhibit strong moral judgment and a high degree of self-sacrifice. Naturally, this proved very popular within that branch of the military, whose members already saw themselves as sitting at the top of the social hierarchy, but the kind of egomaniac this drew to the order inevitably led to its downfall back in 2697. It saw a rebirth under Calvar's descendant Malin Lorix in the 28th century. She first met Haritsa in 2721, and he worked tirelessly to see its official adoption within the Capellan Confederation Armed Forces. Hikaru's proposed organization would exist outside of the formal structure of the CCAF. Its members would be chosen before even becoming teenagers, spending the rest of their youth in training to become the finest MechWarriors in the state. They would owe allegiance only to the head of the warrior house and the Chancellor themselves. Sadly, the aged colonel was not able to bring his plans to fruition before his passing, but Komachi Amara took up the torch. After making his own modifications to the doctrine, he petitioned Dainmar Liao for the permission and funding he needed. The Chancellor, having already lost the support of his colonels and now living in fear of a military coup, was looking for an alternate means of ensuring his safety. He passed the Decree of Military Unity in 2864, giving Komachi the go-ahead. A great deal of funding intended for post-war rebuilding was channeled into this scheme, raising the ire of the common people. Nevertheless, after a decisive victory in competition by the newly formed warrior House Amara over the veterans of the Prefectorate Guard, Liao declared the experiment a great success. Their strength bolstered, the Capellans girded for war. When word of the Draconis Combine invasion of the Lyran Commonwealth reached Prime Marshal Peter Davion at his headquarters on Kintari IV, he immediately departed for the capital New Avalon. Numerous times throughout his military career, he had restricted his offensive campaigns at First Prince Michael Davion's request, and twice he had quashed potential coups aimed at unseating his nephew for his apparent disinterest. Now though, he pleaded his case that there would never be a better opportunity to reclaim those worlds taken by the dragon since the start of the Succession Wars. After 2 weeks of discussion, Michael finally gave his approval. Operation Pendragon was launched on April 19th, bringing a third great house into the war. The campaign had been in the planning stages since the fall of Robinson, and the primary goal was the recapture of that former Draconis March capital. Pendragon would not rely on shock and awe to win the day, as the reality facing each of the Inner Sphere militaries was that the strategies employed during the First and Second Succession Wars were no longer feasible. As a general rule, the Third Succession War saw very few large-scale invasions. Kurita's opening gambit would mark the greatest number of systems to change hands within a single year for over a century. Instead, the new conflict was permeated by constant low-level raiding for supplies or resources, with the objective often simply to prevent the enemy from attacking them back. It was much closer to the pre-Starlig era battles fought throughout the Age of War. Operation Pendragon proceeded at a very conservative pace in its early years. Small-scale raids along the front rarely involved more than a company, but whenever a vulnerable target was identified by their reconnaissance, a larger task force would strike hard at this new objective. 7 minor attacks took place in the first year alone, leading to 3 full invasions. When the armed forces of the Federated Sons launched into action along the Draconis March in April 2866, those within the Capellan March were held back, much to the chagrin of many regional commanders. Among those frustrated to be missing out was Duke Orlando Hasek's son, Jerome. As Field Marshal of the Serdar Polymorphous Defense Zone, he was able to raise a considerable force of mercenaries without drawing much suspicion. He intended to employ them in a private campaign against the Capellan Confederation, hoping to exploit recent turmoil across the border. Chancellor Dainmar Liao had been pressured by his son into abdicating, lest he bring down the entire family with him. On June 16, 2866, Otto Liao was declared the new head of state. Shamed by the part he had played in his realm's dwindling fortunes, Dainmar would ultimately take his own life on February 28th the next year. Within days of Otto's ascension, Jerome Hasek's invasion began. Initial losses were high for the Capellans, but the Chancellor proved a far more capable ruler than his father, able to rally his forces in short order. Hasek's private war became a largely merc-on-merc affair, as Otto mirrored his tactics by employing large numbers of soldiers for hire to bolster his defense. He was so desperate for more troops to throw into the fight that not all of the newly recruited units were particularly trustworthy, but for now, the mercenary regiments and warrior house proved capable of countering the AFFS. By the middle of 2866, the Freewells League found itself as the only successor state yet to become embroiled in the Third Succession War. Captain General Philippa Marik was under no illusion that her realm would not remain apart from the conflict. It was only a matter of time before the fighting spread to her borders. Unfortunately, she did not feel qualified to take the fight to the enemy. She had secured power only 5 years earlier by championing an end to the Second Succession War, but her efforts to bury the hatchet with House Steiner had not been fruitful. There was too much lingering animosity between the two states for any sort of ceasefire to hold. Local commanders began ordering small-scale raids in late 2866, but the Freewells League had not yet officially declared war on any of its rivals. The successor states they bordered had both adopted a defensive posture, presenting no immediate threat, but of the two, the Lyran Commonwealth was looking more vulnerable as Kurita continued their advance towards Skye. Duke Robin Hallis of the Grand Duchy of Oriente urged Philippa Marik to attack their Corwood neighbour while they were distracted. Emissaries were dispatched to the Draconis Combine to discuss the possibility of coordinating their actions. Though they only received a lukewarm response, this was enough for the Captain General to commit to the strike. Rather than begin with an invasion of some border world, Philippa instead went straight for the jugular. She ordered the assassination of her old friend, Elizabeth Steiner. Blueprints of the secret tunnels beneath the Triad complex on Tharkad, in safe possession for the last 300 years, were used to plot the attack. Infiltrating the government center on May 3, 2867, the strike team made it all the way to the throne room, coming within sight of their quarry. Moments before they opened fire, the vigilant MechWarriors sitting within their griffins spotted the intruders, instantly engaging the threat with lethal force, crushing the League agents underfoot. Though she survived the attack, the betrayal cut deeply at Elizabeth Steiner, who unhappily declared war on the one successor lord she had seen as a kindred spirit. The assassination attempt may have ended in failure, but it was not a total loss for the Freewells League. The Draconis Combine looked at the audacity of the action with grudging admiration, though they did not approve of the underhanded nature of it. The Coordinator would end up ordering the ISF to share some limited information with their counterparts in SAFE. Marik used this intelligence to scale up their raids into a full invasion of the Federation of Sky in 2869, to be led by Grand Duke Robin Hallis. The Lyran Commonwealth began hemorrhaging worlds to both rival powers, with the Draconis Combine advancing as far as Marfik by the end of the decade. Field Marshal Jerome Hasek's campaign against the Capellan Confederation made only limited progress in its first few years, capturing just 3 planets of any particular worth. Jerome guessed that as long as he continued to net the Federated Sun's additional systems, his superiors would not order him to call off the assault, but this did mean he would have to maintain his aggression. In 2869, he acquired Clinton's Cutthroats to further bolster his mercenary army in preparation for the next attack on Verlo. They spearheaded the assault, supported by 7 conventional regiments. The invasion bogged down almost immediately, but by 2870, the AFFS's strength in numbers was beginning to win out. Things would take an unexpected turn in March, when a mysterious unmarked jumpship arrived in system. A single dropship descended to the planet, landing just outside the mercenary bivouac, whereupon a pair of emissaries disembarked and requested an audience with Colonel Hondo Clinton. Jerome made repeated demands for an explanation as to what was happening, but he was stonewalled by everyone in the camp. After 3 days of uncertainty, another 7 dropships touched down, and the colonel suddenly announced that his entire unit would be breaking contract and leaving aboard the unknown vessels immediately. Hasek ordered his loyal troops to engage the mercenaries, losing 3 conventional regiments in the ensuing battle, but was not able to prevent their departure. As the Cutthroats were lifting off, the Capellans descended on the disorganized survivors, forcing the Field Marshal to flee Verlo with his tail tucked between his legs. Unable to win sufficient victories to excuse his vainglorious actions, his military career was practically over. Putting that aside, the question everyone wanted answering was where were Clinton's Cutthroats going? They left the system on March 29, 2870, but no attempts to trace their movements have ever uncovered even a single sighting post-Verlo. They simply disappeared entirely. There are numerous theories as to who the unknown ships belonged to. They were of Star League vintage and in pristine condition, showing none of the battle damage typical of the Succession Wars. The most plausible theory was that they were approached by ComStar, but there is no evidence to suggest they ever returned to Terra. If they did accept a garrison contract with the technocratic communications cult, it was for some other secret facility, hidden elsewhere within the Inner Sphere. Robin Hallis's new campaign required significant manpower to achieve its objectives. The FWLM began shifting all of their reserves to this front abandoning the Periphery border, and notably their occupation of Cercinus in 2871. Unfortunately, within months of the fabled Eridani light horse making it to the front, their contract with Marik expired. Negotiations with Steiner were already ongoing, and the Great House was more than happy to offer the former SLDF unit employment, granting them a landhold on Old House in the bargain. To complement the newly acquired ELH, House Kelswar of Tamar raised their own mercenary unit, the Stealthy Tigers, named for their illustrious forebears. They entered onto the rolls 2 years later. The Sky Invasion had drawn the attention of every military district warlord in the Draconis Combine, as each had committed their forces to the drive into Lyran territory. While concentrating their regiments in this fashion won them a number of systems over the first few years, it left them ill-prepared to fend off Davion aggression. As the warlords of Benjamin, Dieron, and Galadin shifted their focus back to the Rimwood border, Miyogi Kurita dispatched his nephew, Shosho Taragi Kurita, to serve as advisor and liaison between the Coordinator and Draconis Combine mustered soldiery. Taragi was a compulsive schemer by nature. His involvement in deciding the outcome of the Shadow War had only exacerbated those tendencies. Chronic motion sickness had prevented him from ever taking to the field, as was Kuritan custom, but he had found a home for himself amongst the bureaucracy of the DCMS, becoming particularly adept at using his status to influence those around him, and to covertly reallocate funds into his own accounts. For him, the Davion front was one enormous playground. He delighted in creating a convoluted web of competing rank and precedence for nobody's benefit but his own amusement, seizing full control of the procurement department in the process. Kurita imposed sweeping delays on even the most basic provisions, claiming that the Sky Invasion Force was hogging everything for themselves. This ensnared every mustered soldiery unit along the border, forcing many commanders to take without asking from local supply depots. Taragi then used their actions to shift the blame onto the other warlords, pitting the three powerful Taishus against one another. The situation devolved so far that the Coordinator himself received a missive from the Sword of Light's Taisho Hirushi Tengwang complaining about the snafu. The Federated Sons did not at first realize the extent of the problems their enemies were facing. For reasons the AFFS couldn't work out, the DCMS were always slow to respond. Nowhere was this more apparent than on Kolia, when in 2872, the 4th Avalon Hussars stumbled into an overwhelming force of 2 mech regiments and supporting aerospace. With little chance of victory, they fled into the hills to escape destruction, but the longer the chase continued, the fewer Kuritan units were able to keep up, as they either broke down or ran out of fuel. In the end, to the shock of Davion commanders, they lifted off Kolia entirely in September, abandoning the worlds to the Federated Sons. This unexpected victory would end up being the last of First Prince Michael Davion's reign. He passed away on May 17, 2873. Just a few months after the death of her fellow successor lord, Philippa Marik also passed on August 8th. She was succeeded by her daughter Marie. The new Captain General inherited a divided realm. Several provinces were openly hostile towards her family. To fill in the gaps the departure of the Eridani light horse had left in her front line, her mother had pulled provincial forces from the duchies of Andurian and Orloff to garrison the conquered Lyran worlds, something which set both Humphreys and Orloff against Marik in Parliament. Lyran counterattacks were able to liberate some of the planets, but these reinforcements were crucial in holding Amity, Nestor, and New Hope. Marie also made efforts to strike at key objectives along the Capellan front, with a raid on Ingersoll in 2874 and another against Assumption in 76. The latter would have consequences for the Marik family, as her cousin Cameron, who was second in line to the throne, was killed in action. The Confederation was having its own troubles, as their over-reliance on disreputable mercenaries came back to haunt them when Brighton's Rangers went rogue on Saxe, forcing the SECAF to deploy aerospace fighters to shoot down the would-be pirates. 2 years later, the FWLM descended on Chisholm. The invasion was only turned back by the heroic defense of Captain Edward Elgin, and the system was renamed to honor his sacrifice. After 3 decades of restraint, the ascension of Karl Davion to the throne promised to grant the armed forces of the Federated Sons the freedom to be more aggressive in their campaigns. Peter Davion also gave up his position as Prime Marshal to restore the traditional position of Commander-in-Chief to the sitting First Prince. Karl himself was an accomplished general who had been frustrated with his father's Olymperistic approach to the succession wars, even becoming the figurehead of one of the planned coups against him. However, he had little interest in court affairs and spent as much time as he could on the front lines. Unfortunately, this came at the expense of the rest of the realm, which since his grandfather's reformations at the turn of the century, was heavily reliant on a First Prince being present on New Avalon to function. Karl led the AFFS to victory on New Iverson and Town over the next 2 years, the latter being the site of the first battle in the post-Stalag era. The planet David was going to be a tougher nut to crack, with the DCMS holed up inside Fort Teague. When the Davion Guards began the assault in 2876, the massed firepower of the Kuritan Bastion inflicted a heavy toll on the unit. To break the stalemate, the First Prince focused his energy on a single point in the perimeter wall. Karl Davion was the first through the breach, but succumbed to the overwhelming fire within, bringing his short reign to a premature end on August 4th. His sister, General Melissa Davion, took up the mantle in his stead, leading her troops to eventual victory on David. But the joy of recovering a world lost to the dragon decades past was tempered by the death of both Karl and another great hero of the AFFS, former Prime Marshal Peter Davion, who passed away on January 9th the following year. Like her brother before her, Melissa Davion's ambitions also revolved around the armed forces of the Federated Sons, but glory in battle did not factor into it. Throughout Operation Pendragon, Melissa had been continually frustrated by the lack of cooperation between the different branches of the AFFS. Everyone looked out for themselves only, with elitism on the part of the MechWarriors and aerospace pilots running rampant, setting the more conventional armor and infantry regiments against them. This was a problem that was endemic across all successor state militaries. If House Davion could foster greater synergy between them, they could outperform their rivals on the field. The Model Army revisions would do for the armed forces what the Reformations had done for government within the Federated Sons. It was a process that would take approximately 15 years to complete, with each successive improvement trialled in the fires of Pendragon. One of our key aims was to strip away as much of the bureaucracy as possible, eliminating redundant departments and granting the remaining officers both greater authority and responsibility. Her connections among the military brass allowed her the freedom to make these sweeping changes, with one of her closest advisors during this period being Field Marshal Gerald Lennox, her rumoured paramour. At the heart of our Model Army program was the concept of regimental combat teams. These differed from the earlier Stalag formations that shared the name, which were groupings of several independent units, typically battlemech focused. Instead, each new RCT would be built around one of the AFFS's surviving mech regiments, reinforced with additional aerospace fighters, with permanently assigned conventional forces in support. These units would train together, deploy together, and fight together. This cohesion would greatly increase their fighting prowess on the field, and might even lead to the enemy underestimating them. but it came at the expense of an increased transportation cost. Not since the Star League Defense Force had such large combined arms brigades been a fixture on the battlefield, and it was quite an adjustment for Davion logistics, but trimming the fat helped keep things moving. Ten years had passed since the commencement of the Third Succession War, and the conflict showed no signs of abating anytime soon, much to the satisfaction of the ComStar First SUCKit. From their headquarters at the Hilton Head HBG station on Terra, they sat back and observed the chaos around them, safe within the eye of the storm. Only when some action threatened to bring the war to an end did they intervene, always careful to obscure their involvement. Raymond Karpov's time as Primus of ComStar had come to an end back in 2875. On May 5th, he voluntarily resigned his position, the first Primus to do so. The powers granted by Organizational Edict 3056 granted Raymond the authority to name his successor, nominating Precentor Arcturus Andrea Martin. She was an unusual pick, the most moderate of the First Circuits by some margin, but her popularity ensured a peaceful transition. Though officially retired, Karpov would still wield considerable influence over the Sacred Order until his death on August 11, 2880. Andrea's time as Primus was defined by the crisis that emerged in the first years of her rule. From the moment ComStar was first founded in 2786, the branch of Terran Affairs had served as the de facto world government within the Sol system. It's often overlooked that of Earth's population of a little over 6 billion, plus another 1.5 billion spread throughout the rest of the solar system, only a tiny fraction worked for ComStar. The rest lived in a sort of closed ecosystem, a relative paradise distinct from the rest of humanity. The BTA had a fairly hands-off approach, allowing the administrative districts on Terra and assorted space colonies a good degree of freedom to conduct their own business, maintaining their control through propaganda about the barbaric successor states and the horrors of the succession wars. This came with an unintended consequence. A large percentage of Earth's population thought that the time was right for Terra to re-emerge as the dominant power within the inner sphere and bring harmony to the outer colonies. This aligned with ComStar's own ambitions, but it was still far too early for such action to not result in an immediate counterattack from the Great Houses. Other groups, such as the Terran Liberation Front, wanted to go further, restoring the old Congress at Geneva and returning ComStar to its place as a humble Department of Communications. Such talk would often result in a visit from Rom and transfer to a re-education camp. When word started to spread that ComStar was behaving in this fashion, it sparked a wave of violent protest. Installations across the planet became targets, and the Primus faced the very real possibility that ComStar was about to be unseated in a popular uprising. Things came to a head in mid-2877, when a militant group called Black December detonated a bomb inside the Channel Tunnel, flooding the underground Continental Link, leading to the deaths of over 1,000 people. Their suspected target was member of the First Circuit Precentor New Earth, Gerald Comandi, who was only spared from his fate when heavy traffic at Calais prevented him from boarding his scheduled connection on time. The terrorist attack shifted public sentiment in completely the other direction, as people endorsed the extreme measures ComStar took to hunt down the culprits. However, the Black December fugitives knew something that no one else did, save for Precentor Rom Jolene Weber. They were innocent. The bombing had been a false flag operation ordered by Martine, and it worked exactly as she had envisioned. To ensure this revelation was kept under wraps, all members of Black December were shot on sight during the raid on their headquarters 3 months later. Though the immediate crisis was averted, the Primus was not out of the woods yet. The First Circuit suspected that there was more to the Channel Tunnel bombing than she was letting on. Andrea's costly investment in Terran infrastructure as a means to win popular support emptied ComStar's coffers, leading to an economic downturn in 2878, which further tarnished her image. 4 years later, the conservative faction of the First Circuit withdrew their support entirely, and she was only able to regain it by naming their ringleader as her chosen successor, Precentor Caf Dwight Kirsten. Beginning in 2880, the Freewells League would go through a quick cycle of Captains General over the next few years. Marie Marik was succeeded by her brother, but James was already ill with Branthian flu at the time he took office. His short reign was marked by unsuccessful efforts to break the stalemate along the Capellan border. The invasion of Zion ended in defeat, then the Seacaf's counterattack against Liao was rebuffed in 2881. Though their raid on Callaway 6 did cause some damage. James Marik died from health complications a year later. This caused a minor succession crisis, as his nearest living relative was his twice-removed cousin Samuel, a boy only 13 years old. The Marik family had been gutted during the Second Succession War. More than twice as many members as any other great house had been killed in combat, not to mention 3 heirs that joined ComStar. Stepping forward as regent was Admiral Lloyd Marik Stanley. His appointment to the position was backed by the duchies of Andurian and Orloff, and from the outset he was viewed as a somewhat anti-Marik candidate, one who could curb the ruling family's power by firmly entrenching himself in various state departments while Samuel was still in his minority. Lloyd's ascension to power looked guaranteed, until an unexpected face appeared in Parliament on June 21, 2883. Samuel's aunt, Precentor Elizabeth Marik, had received a communication from James 6 months before his passing, naming her heir to the throne. Admiral Marik Stanley had been stationed at Hassad when the news from Atreus filtered back to him. He immediately contested Elizabeth's claim to the throne, citing her 2 decades in service to ComStar as a reason not to trust her. Ironically, his suspicions would have been correct had Primus Raymond Karpov not passed away a few years earlier. His scheme to take over a successor state by subverting one of the Great House heirs had been behind the effort to recruit Elizabeth decades earlier. Primus Andrea Martin had less interest in such matters. Rightly or wrongly, many flocked to Marik Stanley's banner. The spectre of a civil war started to grow. To avoid such a calamity, Elizabeth Marik made a proposal that she hoped would satisfy both of them. The Admiral would be named Commander-in-Chief of the Freewells League military, while she would serve as head of state and restrict her activities to just the political sphere. Though he initially proved intractable, in the end, Duke Arthur Humphreys was able to talk Lloyd down. The 2 contenders agreed to the compromise. Melissa Davion's model army reforms continue to improve the fortunes of the armed forces of the Federated Sons, but the same could not be said for the Draconis Combine mustered soldiery. Taragi Kurita continued to force his officers to jump through increasingly obstructive hoops. Their only tangible success on the Davion front in the early years of the Third Succession War was the capture of Tancredi IV. The Shosho was not oblivious to the issues he was causing, but nor was Taragi creating supply chaos without a goal in mind. In several instances, he would step in at the last moment to ensure a unit received the parts and ammunition it needed to defend a planet, then take the credit afterwards. His ambition was to make the warlords appear incompetent in order to secure greater power for himself. After several high-profile failures in 2885, Kurita believed he had sufficient evidence to make his case. Approaching his uncle, Coordinator Miyogi Kurita, Taragi suggested that if the Davion offensive was to be stopped, command of the entire front would have to be given to one man. naturally, as someone who was familiar with the region and skilled at orchestrating the movement of troops, he was the obvious pick for this position. Miyogi thanked him for his counsel, agreed with his assessment that one individual should take charge in order to stop the bleeding, and then promptly appointed his son Taishu John Kurita to the post. Taragi was outraged at being passed over yet again. Despite his father's decision not to name him heir, he saw the coordinator's position as his birthright. He would not allow his cousin to steal that from him. Instead, Taragi began plotting to remove his uncle, and knew exactly who he could turn to as an ally in this endeavour. After a decade of home confinement for her involvement in the Shadow War, Rowena Kurita had been granted partial amnesty a few years prior. Despite the purges that had gutted the internal security force in the wake of that dispute, there was still a handful of agents within the organization who owed allegiance to Rowena. Miyogi's inability to heal the rift between himself and the ISF allowed those survivors to yet again turn the intelligence agency against him. It's not clear exactly what Rowena thought of her nephew when Taragi approached her later that year. Perhaps she saw some of her past self in his schemes, or maybe his games with the DCMS came across as juvenile to the elder Kuritan, and it was simply a desire for vengeance against her brother Miyogi that led Rowena to take his side. Either way, she counseled him on how best to eliminate the competition. Unsurprisingly, without having to worry about interference from Taragi, the Combine's advance into the Federation of Sky was going far more smoothly. Ride, Skondia, and Vega had all been taken in the last 15 years, and the LCAF seemed incapable of turning the assault. Bolstering their defensive line with elite mercenary units such as the Eridani Light Horse and Tamar's Stealthy Tigers hadn't worked, nor had their attempt to draw troops away from the main thrust against them by launching a counterattack along the Corward edge of their border in 2885. Their 3 new conquests were swiftly abandoned once it became clear that nobody was coming for them. In the Capellan Confederation, Chancellor Otto Liao was making radical changes to the organization of his armed forces. The old brigades had been so badly ravaged by the First and Second Succession Wars that they had pretty much ceased to exist. The few regiments that had made it out the other side were a patchwork of various different companies and battalions from countless sources across the realm. Each unit had strayed away from established doctrine to adopt new tactics that allowed the mishmash of troops at their disposal to achieve some semblance of cohesion in the field. The CCAF's failure to make any appreciable gains during the Third Succession War made their shortcomings abundantly clear. The best they could boast of was a successful counterattack on Aldebaran, which saw both Admiral Marik Stanley and his ally Duke Humphreys killed in action, bringing an end to the fragmented rule within the Freewells League. In many respects, this was more of a boon than a curse for their rival successor state. Without the industrial capital to properly rebuild his military, Liao was forced to reorganize the entire Capellan Confederation armed forces in such a way that these disparate groups could still be used in an effective manner on a strategic scale. Henceforth, each commonality would host its own reserve brigade, filled with whatever ragtag battlemech regiments had survived up to this point. Only the St. Ives Armoured Cavalry and the elite Capellan Hussars would remain as distinct entities on the rolls. The Andurian and Chesterton commonalities had been almost entirely overrun during the prior conflict, and the prefects from those regions were eager to see Otto make a push to recover at least some of their territory. Instead, the Chancellor shocked them all when he openly acknowledged what few others in the Confederation dared to see. The CCAF was wholly incapable of taking the fight to their enemies, and continuing to stretch themselves thin along the front line would no doubt lead to a repeat of La Reconquista or Winter Garden. As such, he recalled the vast majority of his remaining strength away from the border, to the horror of the nobility whose land and property was now dangerously exposed. The new strategy, dubbed Elastic Defense, was for the perimeter systems to be garrisoned by a nationalized militia known as the Home Guard, typically a mix of armor and infantry, with a handful of aging mechs thrown in if they were lucky. Their job was to simply stay alive until the mobile reserve could come to their aid. In many ways, this simply formalized the technique Otto's aunt Lorelei had employed during the latter half of the Second Succession War. While the majority of border systems now only possessed a token garrison, a few dozen worlds were transformed into veritable fortresses, too costly to attack directly, but too dangerous to ignore for risk of retaliation. If the defenders there couldn't be dislodged, they would serve as bases of operation for counterattacks against any surrounding systems. Otto Liao had to drag the Prefectorate and senior officers kicking and screaming along with him as he introduced these sweeping reforms. But eventually, the metamorphosis was complete, just as the 29th century was drawing to a close. In 2891, Melissa's model army was ready for its ultimate test, the liberation of Robinson. It had taken 4 years for the Draconis Combine to secure the planet back in the Second Succession War, and the First Prince expected a similar grind to win it back. Leading the attack would be Melissa's half-brother, Marshal Joseph Davion, at the head of her old unit. They made landfall in July, right in the midst of the enemy. Then, on August 12th, the woefully undersupplied Sword of Light abandoned the planet completely. Operation Pendragon was a success. Taisho Yori Granada confronted the two Kuritan cousins, demanding to know why his regiment had not been resupplied, allowing their mechs to completely run dry on the battlefield, thus forcing them to withdraw in disgrace. Taragi chose this moment to uncover the mountain of doctored files he and his internal security force allies had been working on that pinned the blame firmly on John Kurita. Granada then went to the coordinator with this information and demanded that John be removed from command. Miyogi had been grooming his son for power. Doing so would have severely tarnished his reputation, but when he looked for support from other trusted officers, they all distanced themselves from the Kuritan heir. Each had been paid a visit from the ISF, strongly encouraging them to stay neutral in the confrontation. Further undermining the coordinator's position at court were rumours that he was seeking a ceasefire with Davion after so many humiliating defeats over the past 25 years. It was perhaps this which prompted Tai Hideyoshi Toyama to take the action that he did. Shamed by his association with Robinson, he requested an audience with the coordinator, his wish being granted on March 23, 2892. Coming to a halt before him, Hideyoshi bowed respectfully, then detonated the bomb vest he was wearing. Miyogi Kurita was killed instantly, as were Toyama, 3 courtiers, and another 25 guards present in the throne room. The second word of the assassination reached Taragi, he ordered the ISF to arrest John Kurita. A kangaroo court saw him charged with negligence for the defeat on Robinson, and treason for equally spurious links to his father's murder. On March 27th, he was brought before a firing squad and executed. With his competition eliminated, Taragi Kurita achieved his ambition to sit on the chrysanthemum throne. The change in leadership within the Draconis Combine was mirrored in the Federated Sons. Shortly after the liberation of Robinson, First Prince Melissa Davion contracted Joshallan fever. She died on May 13, 2892, succeeded by her half-brother Joseph Davion II, the hero of Robinson. The legacy of Melissa's model army reforms can still be felt today by anyone foolhardy enough to face off against the armed forces of the Federated Sons in battle. Their performance on the field is unparalleled, a strength that will no doubt secure them greater victories in the years to come. It's been a little time since the last upload on this channel, and things haven't quite played out the way that I thought they were going to. I can't remember exactly what I said at the end of the last chapter, but I think I explained how I had divided up the Third Succession War to be more focused on a single successor state at a time. And I was pretty confident that I was going to get one out every weekend for July. That confidence came from the fact I was able to finish the first 4 chapters and get them all up on Patreon pretty quickly, I think within 10 days or so. While the response over there was pretty positive, I had some problems with the way I'd done it that left me pretty dissatisfied with the whole project. I won't go too much into detail about why I wrote it the way that I did initially, but what I found is, by the time I'd done the first hour of it, I had really started to notice the problems that I had created for myself. I thought I was avoiding the problem of jumping around erratically within the inner sphere, because for some long stretches of time, a whole decade in history, there's almost nothing to talk about within a given successor state. But what I actually found was, to create even just a 15-minute video or less, I was going through a whole 50 years of history, which was kind of ridiculous then to have to jump back, 30, 40 years to begin the next one. I mean, imagine trying to cover any real-world history like that, like World War I or something. You talk about the United Kingdom for 25 years, or 25 months, let's say, and then 50 months over in Italy or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then never once mention Germany. Yes, you might say, oh, they were attacked or counterattacked, but you can't discuss what's happening internally within Germany, which is important to understand why events played out the way that they did. And basically I was creating that confusion within the Third Succession War. Now I know I never ever want to come back to this point in history, because God, it's been awful to try and bring all these different narrative threads together, and it's spread out across so many different sources. And I know that I'm never going to be happy if I just push on and keep doing it the way that I had initially wrote it. I wanted it to be something that I'm satisfied with, proud of, at the end, and that meant I was going to have to rewrite chunks of it. Thankfully, I didn't have to redo everything. I could just chop up what I'd done and mix it together into a more cohesive, linear narrative, which hopefully you enjoyed in this episode today. But it's still going to take some time to continue that forwards for the rest of the Third Succession War. Thankfully, I have a backup plan, because we are coming up on a bit of a milestone for this channel. This August 5th, I think it is the 3-year anniversary of me starting this Lore and History series. And it was always my plan to do something special for that. So way back in April-May time, I wrote a 5-part miniseries that I plan to release throughout August, and it is still my plan. So we're going to put the Third Succession War on the back burner for a bit, which is good for me, gives me that time to rewrite it. And instead I'm going to be releasing a different series on the channel. Hopefully you will see the first part of that coming out soon, within a week. I am away on holiday and I haven't even begun it yet, but I'm hopeful when I come back on Saturday I can sprint through it, the first chapter, and get it finished that weekend to come out on Monday 5th. I know people are eager to see the Third Succession will continue, and they're desperate for me to get up to the modern timeline, and nothing that I'm announcing here is helping towards that goal. But this is just the way it's going to be. Hopefully this other project is something that you will enjoy too. Anyway, that's everything for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you for your patience. I know these are coming out a little bit slower than I promised, but hopefully we can get back into the swing of things after I come back in August. If you enjoyed the video today, be sure to give it a like. You can let me know what you thought if you leave a comment. I try to respond to as many of those as I can. If you know anyone who has an interest in BattleTech history, you can share it around with them. All of those things helps YouTube promote it to other people who might have an interest. If you want to support me more, there is a link to my Patreon in the description. I'm currently a little bit behind. It was my intention to have several future episodes up in advance, but because I had to rewrite these, that's fallen by the wayside. Hopefully I can get back into that in August. But either way, thank you very much for watching, and I'll hope to see you soon on another video.